Got
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome again to another CEN seminar. So today we've got Yasin Arslan, who's going to tell us about neurocognitive understanding of learning, the role of educational neuroscience in teacher training. So Yasin is currently a PhD candidate at UCL's Department of Psychology and Human Development. He is a former special educational needs teacher who is now pursuing his research interests in the field of educational neuroscience. And his current focus is on examining the extent to which educational neuroscience is influencing initial teacher training programs in the UK. So take it away, Yasin.
Thank you, Astrid, for the introduction. It actually, sounds more than what I do, but yeah. So let me just start with the outline, actually, what I will do. So I'll start with a brief introduction about the field of educational neuroscience and what the gaps are, some of the gaps that I will address, and how I will address these gaps with my research. And in this research, actually, I will have 3 studies. The first is examining teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience and what factors actually influence this understanding of educational neuroscience. This will be followed by study 2 and study 3. Actually, these study 2 and study 3 both will try to better design a workshop for teachers in educational neuroscience. So this will be just further steps. So I will be mainly focusing on study 1 today. Okay, let's start with some basic history about how we ended up here, actually. Well, in the late 20th century, technological advancements in the late 20th century made it possible to examine the location of neural activation in vivo and to test theories about the organization of cognitive function at the neural level. Well, this then led to the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, which is, in simple terms, it's a field of how we can simply say, examine biological processes and aspects that underlie cognition. So with the principles involved subsequently being extended to social cognitive neuroscience and developmental neuroscience. Well, these fields actually combined neuroimaging with earlier findings and methods of behavioral research in order to better explain the latter. So the increasing amount of research using brain imaging has gained speed, especially during and after the decade of the brain. Decade of the brain, what is this decade of the brain? It was the last decade of the 20th century, defined officially by the US Congress, actually, where there were prospective aims to mobilize funding for more coordinated work in the brain sciences and advancing neuroimaging techniques. These advancements actually also led people to ask if the same approach could then be used to generate deeper understanding of learning processes, which could then be used to optimize teaching. Well, what this question led was that to the emergence of what was variously called mind, brain, and education, neuroscience of education, and educational neuroscience. So this is the field, how it came today. The translational field. Well, at the earlier stages of the field, educational neuroscience was actually initially regarded as a translational field in which researchers would generate evidence that would then be used to tell teachers how they could perform more effectively. Well, this was a one-way translation of neuroscience findings to inform teaching practice. However, in simple terms, telling off teachers what to do is actually problematic, especially when teachers have so much work to do. And this also then led to some criticisms later in the field. For example, this initial regards the one-way translational bridge Brewer, for example, just criticized is as being an impossible task without additional bridges being built between neuroscience and education. Because Brewer claimed that teachers typically misunderstood the implications of neuroscience evidence, and he just identified some additional bridges such as cognitive psychology to make this bridge more feasible. Subsequently, however, those working in the field began to realize that it was not actually about a one-way translation, but actually about bringing teachers, let's say practitioners and researchers together as a community and creating a constructive dialogue and a shared agenda for research that could directly inform practice in a non-reductionist framework. In other words, the aim of the field was identified as providing a bidirectional connection between science and practice, which obviates the need for building bridges between fields, contrary to what Brewer previously criticized. Well, in this dialogue, for example, not only can neuroscience influence education practice, but also practitioners can also collaborate with researchers to influence research questions, for example, and methods in neuroscience. This is a similar way, we can say, as engineering, for instance, which rests on a community of physicists and manufacturers, or medicine, where biologists and medical practitioners collaborate to address medical and health issues. So far, so good. The field's growth. Well, following on this, in the mid-2000s, the field started seeing an organic growth as people began to think in more concrete terms about what educational neuroscience was and what kinds of research it should promote. This growth then led to examining what the role might be within the field for teachers who understood something about the scientific evidence base that came out of research with regards to learning processes and how that might be applied in education. Starting from the late 2000s, there have been attempts to frame this process in educational neuroscience and keep the pace of the field's rapid growth in a coordinated fashion. Along with many international conferences and professional development opportunities, there began to be formal attempts to help create researcher-practitioner dialogue via organizations such as the International Mind, Brain and Education Society, London Center for Educational Neuroscience. This is also followed by journals such as Mind, Brain and Education and Trends in Educational Neuroscience that started publishing the formal work of educational neuroscience. There was also graduate level programs were introduced, such as master's programs in educational neuroscience in the US and the UK. These programs were actually trying to draw an intake of teachers as well as researchers, which is in line with the updated aims of the field. Excuse me. Well, past 10 years, has it been influential though? The notion that education has much to benefit from evidence-based practice, especially brain research, has grown in the past 10 years. And educational neuroscience actually being influential in education and practice. How? It's highly difficult to inform policymakers to make official change in a large scale, but there are some examples that educational neuroscience was actually influential in such changes. Among many examples, one small example could be that educational neuroscience has led to better understanding of neural activities in adolescence and how these functions relate to learning processes. It actually also provided evidence that adolescents get a lack of sleep because of early school start times, for instance, thus feel more tired at school in the early mornings than in the evenings. Well, based on this understanding of adolescence, adolescent neurodevelopment, delayed school start times are found to be effective for decreasing adolescent sleep deprivation, depression, and improving academic outcomes. Following on such evidence, California State, for example, signed a Senate bill into law requiring high schools to start classes no earlier than 8:30, as far as I could remember, and 8 a.m. for middle schools. However, this hasn't been implemented in the UK because of various reasons. One reason could be that UK is using a more different approach in education where schools are free to decide their own school start times. So maybe that's why it hasn't been implemented in the UK yet. Sorry. What now? Well, we see that the field of education neuroscience has potential for education and teaching practice. For instance, there has also been some training programs called Brain U, for example, that increase teachers' self-efficacy a few years back. However, in the current model of educational neuroscience, which is aiming to create a researcher-practitioner dialogue, educational neuroscience actually rests fundamentally on practitioners, especially teachers, who have some accurate understanding of research and research evidence, especially regarding to educational neuroscience evidence. However, there is one thing. There is no formal requirement for teachers to train in detail in neurocognitive mechanisms, neurocognitive learning processes, and understanding evidence. How about initial teacher training programs? Do they provide any? Initial teacher training programs actually provide very little taught content in the field, and the result is that educational neuroscience content knowledge is generally provided through unstructured and informal paths, such as in-service teacher trainings and internet-based information from unknown sources that are not evidence-based, for instance. Most of such informal and unstructured types of training aim to create a one-way translation of neuroscientific knowledge to classroom practice, which, as you may remember, is in line with Brewer's transmissional model, rather than trying to create a dialogue between researchers and practitioners. This also suggests that teachers do not receive a formal and consistent method of training in this area, and they are not exposed to evidence-based educational neuroscience content. Even if teachers are exposed to some educational neuroscience evidence, they might find it challenging to understand and engage with the research evidence due to a lack of previous exposure or a lack of grasp of how to evaluate such exposure. This is important to note because there is evidence that a lack of effective engagement with and understanding of educational neuroscience research evidence can leave teachers susceptible to believe in neuromyths and applying some unscientific teaching methods in the classrooms. So what is a neuromyth? The term actually was first described by a neurosurgeon, Alan Crockett, back in 1990s as a misconception or misunderstanding, unscientific idea about the brain. OECD then described it in an educational context more broadly as misconception generated by a misunderstanding or like scientifically established case for brain research in education and other contexts. So that was the first definition of neuromyths in education that was widely used back then. Well, neuromyths actually are widely used methods to assess teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience. For example, teachers in previous research were presented some neuromyths and some evidence-based statements, which I will call neurofacts, and they were asked to identify which ones were neuromyths and which ones were neurofacts. And using those scores, teachers were assigned some levels of educational neuroscience knowledge of neuromyths, knowledge of neurofacts, etc. But using this method, the results, as you may be seeing in the table, teachers' beliefs in neuromyths was found to be very, very prevalent and persistent among teachers in many various countries, including Turkey, Spain, Germany, US, Australia, etc. Well, as I said, this is a widely used method, but it has a problem, it has a limitation in the approach. This widely used method considers neuromyths and neurofacts separately. So, meaning that they actually do not provide some enough data for differentiation skills to differentiate neuromyth from a neurofact or neurofact from a neuromyth, which is a skill that is necessary for bringing previous knowledge of teachers or a human and apply to spot myths and facts in real life scenarios, which then this brings us to my current research action. Excuse me. I am getting so thirsty. Well, based on the evidence discussed thus far, education neuroscience can be useful for teachers to optimize their teaching practice. However, teachers start their careers without sufficient knowledge or any knowledge at all about education neuroscience. And without this knowledge, actually, teachers may not effectively understand and engage with evidence from educational neuroscience. Therefore, they might become vulnerable to neuromyths. In order to address this, teachers require some specific skills to evaluate and digest research evidence to be able to critically evaluate this evidence. Based on this, the objective of my current PhD project is to examine teachers' knowledge level regarding education neuroscience and the processes of engagement with this evidence from this field. To achieve this, I will have 3 studies. In study 1, I developed a neuromyths and neurofacts test using a novel tool that I will explain quite shortly. This tool assesses teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience and to identify which factors actually influence this level of understanding of education neuroscience evidence. This was done, as you might remember, followed by a study 2, which is focus groups, and study 3, which is a workshop in education neuroscience that I will explain once I explain study 1. Well, research questions and hypothesis. I have 3 research questions. The first is, what is the knowledge level of teachers with regard to educational neuroscience? What factors influence teachers' knowledge of educational neuroscience? And to what extent can teachers in education neuroscience, I'm sorry, I couldn't even read what I wrote. So to what extent can training teachers in education neuroscience improve their knowledge of this field of research? To address these research questions, actually the study 1 that I will explain answered first 2 research questions, which were, what is the knowledge level of teachers regarding education neuroscience, and what factors influence teachers' knowledge level? For the research question 3, I will address using study 2 and study 3. Based on these research questions, I have developed 3 hypotheses that I examined in study 1. In the hypothesis, I checked the relationship of teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience with some factors. Well, the first hypothesis that I proposed was that there will be a significant negative relationship between years of teaching experience and teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience. In that, teachers who have taught for longer periods of time will probably have longer or lower knowledge level. In the second hypothesis, there would be a significant positive relationship between exposure to any type of education neuroscience training and teachers' knowledge level. That means that teachers who received any type of education neuroscience training would be better able to differentiate neuromyths from neurofacts. To understand this relationship in more detail, exposure to different levels of education neuroscience training were compared under 4 groups. So as you might be seeing here, we have education neuroscience training levels, 4 levels. Level 1 is the highest level, which is the formal level. It has undergrad level, postgrad level, or doctoral level of education neuroscience training, which is formal type. The second level is CPD, which is continuing professional development level, but no formal education neuroscience training. The third is informal exposure, which is engagement with professional or educational materials, such as magazines, blogs, etc., that is related to educational neuroscience, but no formal educational neuroscience or CPD level. And the last one, which is the lowest, is no exposure at all. Using these 4 groups, I also proposed the last hypothesis of study 1, which was that formal type of educational neuroscience training would lead to higher knowledge than any other identified education neuroscience training groups. So in other words, those who received not any formal type of education neuroscience training would be better able to identify and get more scores in education neuroscience than those who received CPD level, informal exposure level, or no exposure at all. So what I'm doing is that I'm trying to find a statistically significant results to show the extent to which formal type of education neuroscience training is actually effective in improving teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience. So I have used an online questionnaire. There was 4 sections, which included demographics, teaching qualifications, teaching experience, and educational neuroscience levels. There were in total 36 items, 18 neuromyths, and 18 neurofacts. And these neurofacts and neuromyths were presented in a random order on a 5-point Likert scale. And to identify specific types of profiles, for example, neuromyths and neurofacts were categorized under 2 groups. Those related to special educational needs, as you can see here, and those related to general cognitive function, which is, I will call non-SEN statements. So there were equal number of neuromyths and neurofacts, 18, but in terms of the specific types of profiles, there were also similar or equal number of neuromyths. For example, there was 8 neuromyths related to special educational needs and 8 neurofacts related to special needs. Moreover, 10 statements that is related to general cognitive function and 10 neurofacts or evidence-based statements in general cognitive function, non-SEN statements. The survey was open for about 2 months and 368 full responses were received, all UK teachers. 79% was female, which is in line with UK's current teacher demographics actually. And the completion actually took less than 15 minutes. The results. Well, as I discussed, one of the limitations of the previous research is that Neuromats scores are used and analyzed separately from Neurofact scores. However, endorsing a Neuromat, or let's make it in a different way, endorsing a Neurofact is as good level of indicator as rejecting a Neuromat for assessing teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience. So what I'm trying to say is that it is very important to see to what extent teachers endorse Neuromats or endorse Neurofacts. But if we use these scores separately, analyze them separately, then we might not be able to see the overall picture of the differentiation scores. So I used this in order to see an overall picture of teachers' education neuroscience knowledge. We created a differentiation measure, which answered first two research questions. In this differentiation measure, the mean Neurofact scores were subtracted from the mean Neuromat scores, with more scores indicating greater differentiation, thus greater knowledge level of educational neuroscience. The maximum score that teachers would get was 72, and there was a normal distribution of the knowledge level of educational neuroscience. And the mean differentiation score was actually 19.49 out of 72. We then used this measure to see if participants' responses were by chance. As you may remember, we had three groups of questions: all items, 36 items, SEN-related items, which is 16, and non-SEN-related items, which is 20. One sample t-tests were conducted to check differences from chance responding in these groups, and this then provided a platform to consider which factors influence teachers' differentiation scores. With these t-tests, we compared means of all items, SEN-related items, and non-SEN-related items with 0 to see if their responses were by chance. Actually, the results show that their responses were significantly higher than 0, indicating that their responses were not by chance. However, considering that the mean differentiation score for all items, which was 19.49, indicates that this differentiation performance is actually not very substantial. Thus, the mean knowledge of education neuroscience was defined as low. Okay, correlations to see which factors actually influence this knowledge level. Now that we have a measure to calculate teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience, now I'm just trying to find out which factors actually influence this understanding. From the previous t-test results, it actually provided this platform to consider which factors. Here, years of teaching experience and exposure to training in education neuroscience were measured as the predictors of performance on the questionnaire. As you can see here, we found a non-significant result between years of teaching experience and differentiation scores, meaning that this factor doesn't really influence teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience. However, we found a significant relationship between educational neuroscience training, but this is any type of educational neuroscience training, and differentiation scores. This means that teachers who had some exposure to education neuroscience training were better able to differentiate Neuromats from Neurofacts. Let me just remind you, Neurofact was the evidence-based statements. Now that we've found a significant relationship between education neuroscience training and differentiation scores, let's just move on to examining different types of education neuroscience training. Well, as you may remember from the hypothesis, we had 4 levels of education neuroscience training, which were formal type, CPD, continuing professional development, informal type, and no exposure at all. Among these groups, I checked which specific type or types of educational neuroscience training was significantly correlated with differentiation scores. We found that there was no significant relationship between differentiation scores and CPD level educational neuroscience training. Also, no significant relationship between informal educational neuroscience training and differentiation scores. However, we found a significant relationship between formal educational neuroscience training, formal and structured type of educational neuroscience training. Just to remind you, formal type was anything that is graduate level or postgraduate level, bachelor's degree, postgrad degree, PGCE, postgraduate certificate, etc. And there was a significant relationship between these two. This means that the only significant factor among training groups influencing differentiation scores seems to be the formal training. Okay. I then checked the mean differentiation scores among 4 groups, 4 training levels, as you can see here. You can see the mean scores of formal training. Those who received formal training received 28 of 45. CPD level was 2074, informal 2058, and no training at all was 16.03. I used a one-way ANOVA to compare the means of differentiation score, which was the dependent variable, across levels of educational neuroscience training, which was the independent variable. The results actually allowed us to accept our hypothesis that there was a main effect of levels of training on differentiation index, which means that there was a significant difference between groups. That also means the mean scores of these groups were significantly different from each other. But we still don't know which score is the highest statistically. Of course, we can see it from here. The formal type of training is the highest, but we don't know if there is like a statistically significant result that we can infer. So to see if there is this statistical result, I ran post hoc comparisons using the Bonferini test to see the degree of significance between levels of educational neuroscience training. And as you might be seeing from the table, the mean score for the formal type of educational neuroscience training was significantly higher than the mean scores of all other training groups. This means that those who received formal type of educational neuroscience training scored the highest, statistically highest scores, higher scores than CPD level, those who received continuing professional development, informal exposure group, and no exposure group. This also allowed us to uphold the hypothesis that the formal education neuroscience training group would be better able to differentiate neuromyths from neurofacts, therefore indicating a better knowledge of education neuroscience compared to the other groups. Okay, to sum up, there was a variation in scores, but we have found that the formal type of education neuroscience training is the most effective for improving education neuroscience knowledge level. Therefore, we are currently examining how we can train teachers in educational neuroscience. So the ongoing examination is how we can train teachers in educational neuroscience. In study 2, I will run focus groups to examine teachers' processes of engagement with their previous educational neuroscience training. So the aim of these focus groups is to understand the processes of engagement with educational neuroscience training and materials. The participants of the focus groups will be drawn from study 1, and there are 2 group targets which was segmented according to the educational neuroscience training that teachers received and that I identified in study 1. So as you may remember, we had 4 different types of educational neuroscience training levels. The highest was formal level. Number 2 was CPD level. The 3rd level was informal exposure and no exposure at all. So I used only those who received some or any type of education neuroscience training. So the first group of focus groups was formal type, those who received formal type of education in neuroscience, and other group, which included teachers who received CPD level or informal level of educational neuroscience training. And 2 focus groups per target were designed, and 5 participants would join each target. In total, 4 times 5, we will have 20 participants for the focus groups. And this study is actually still ongoing, and I'm still recruiting. So far, we have received 17 responses who are willing to participate focus groups. In the upcoming next few weeks, hopefully, I will achieve the required 20, and we will just run focus groups to better design a workshop that will explain in this slide. So once the focus groups are complete, I will use study 2 and study 1 results to design this formal type of education neuroscience training for teachers. The aim of this training is to see or to find an answer on whether training in educational neuroscience or training teachers in educational neuroscience can improve teachers' knowledge level of educational neuroscience. So what we mean by improving is, again, statistical results that we will try to achieve to see if that's really effective, evidence-based effect. The core content is actually still in discussion, but it will probably include introduction to the research skills, how to do research, and how to engage with research evidence, especially from education neuroscience topics. And it will also include, excuse me, introduction to the field of education neuroscience and what it offers possibly. And memory, attention, motivation, etc. The list goes on, actually. It's a pretty long list. So, and we'll need to be very careful about finding out some topics, choosing topics that are relevant to improving teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience, but also we also need to bear in mind that teachers' current workload is pretty high. So the workshop is not going to be like very intense for teachers that, you know, that is very difficult to complete, etc. In this workshop, I will use a flipped classroom instructional strategy where participants complete a preparation material or materials asynchronously in their own time, and then join synchronous sessions to create discussions around this topic. So as I said, this is still in discussion. Once the results are clear, I'm very happy to share the results of it. So to conclude, educational neuroscience training can be useful. The findings from the project actually highlight this potential contribution of educational neuroscience training to teachers' knowledge level. But its type, for example, structured, the delivery method, etc., should be structured and should be delivered in a coordinated formal fashion for instance, through initial teacher training programs to avoid misunderstanding and misconceptions, and to be careful about snake oil salesmen. Finally, the results of this project will be made available to those who are interested in the researcher-practitioner dialogue that the field of educational neuroscience is aiming to achieve. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you liked it, and stay tuned to hear more about the full outcomes of the project, and I can get questions now.
Wow, thank you so much, Yasin. I bet you were sitting there thinking, what on earth is going on in the chat? The chat is absolutely popping off.
Should I
feel like this is such a... You can stop sharing if you'd like to, yeah.
Yeah.
So
you can reach, sorry to interrupt, Astrid. I was just going to say, whoever is interested in learning more about the outcomes of this project can, find me on Twitter. My research page or my email is here. Let us know.
You can just leave it up there if you'd like to. Yeah, it might be nice so people have a chance to write it down. Yes, so we have lots of engagement in the chat. In fact, I was thinking you could have stopped talking like 10 minutes ago and we'd probably have loads to talk about. I'm still going to use my chair privilege to ask something first, because I think it might help to just have a little bit of framing of this topic, because I think kind of the crux of kind of your project and, kind of a crossover in both of our PhD projects is this issue of bridging the theory practice gap, this gap that exists between scientists and practitioners, and not just in a one-way fashion, but in this bi-directional fashion where the evidence from classrooms is also informing theory. But still, as you highlighted, the focus is usually on optimizing learning using neuroscience knowledge, and not listening to teachers and kind of using their expertise to optimize our research and our sort of theoretical approaches. Even with Neuromats, it's like, oh, we, the scientists, have the knowledge and you don't, and you need to be listening to us. I just wondered if you had any kind of, I know it's not a question you can answer as such, but do you have any kind of general thoughts on sort of challenging this dynamic that we keep on falling into?
No, definitely, Astrid. That's a good question. And this is the core question, one of the core questions of the field, actually. It is trying to find this dialogue between researchers and practitioners, but the practitioners is actually teachers the starting point. Well, you're right. It is still kind of sounds like neuroscience heavy, and neuroscientists are telling off teachers what to do, etc., which is the problematic part, because teachers are not heard. Teachers' voices are not heard in this case. So the further steps might be aiming to bring teachers and researchers together in a table, for example, and to discuss and to create research questions, to do research together, to influence what type of research questions the field should try to aim to find, because teachers might not be having some accurate understanding of how this neuroscience evidence work, but in the same time, neuroscientists, for example, also don't know how the school practice work. So we need to influence neuroscientists in terms of how practice works, school being a teaching classroom teacher is, and in the same time also we need to influence teachers how this evidence-based practice works. But this is the
worth noting on that point. I do think as well there has been a bit of a shift in the field, especially with people like yourself and myself. I know Kristen, who's here as well, people who are practitioners who have now kind of transitioned more into academia. So maybe we have a role in kind of trying to bridge that gap. With that said, there's a lot going on in the chat. So let's have a little look at what's been going on. So the first question came from Liza, and she asked, I was wondering about the levels of skepticism on how neuroscience findings can be applied in the classroom. Education is influenced by politics, as we know, And given the state of how schools are functioning and the amount of children in the classroom, you know, teachers are already doing a lot, you know, and also neuroscience is kind of behind, you know, what's being implemented in practice. So I think there's something there about the speed of research and the speed of these findings and their relevance. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, this is a good question. Thank you for this question. Actually, yes, there are so many. Neuroscience is an umbrella term. It's so big, it's so wide, and it actually does research on everything that we can think about. The human mind, let's say, human brain, or cognitive mechanisms, etc. So, of course, not everything can be related to classroom practice. But there are evidence-based things that are effective, that works in a classroom. For example, a better understanding of how the motivation works can help a teacher. How an attention works in the brain can help a teacher. Or in terms of diagnosis, for example, to find out which type of intervention, for example, in dyslexia, works better in children of having dyslexia. There is evidence for that. So it can also be used. But it's an important point to highlight. Again, not everything can be used in the classroom. So we need to be picky about what is really relevant directly and what is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Great point. I'm a little bit confused because the chat is jumping around because I think people are replying to other people. So I'll just keep going down. I'll make sure everybody gets asked, but I'll just keep going down methodically and and getting to them as we get to them. So the next question I've got at the top here is from Selma, and they ask, oh, this was a question specifically about your study and the survey that you did. What if teachers are familiar with the neuromyths that were included just because of the popularity and the exposure to those neuromyths and not because their general knowledge about neuroscience is advanced or not advanced? So what if that doesn't indicate the quality of their teaching, their pedagogical skills, and did you take that into consideration when you chose those neuromyths?
2 points, actually. One is evidence is updating itself. So neuromyth studies are not new in the field. For example, if we keep using the statements that were used 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we might not be having accurate results of teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience, because there are so many things that is going on in the field. For example, master's programs, CPD programs that are aiming to debunk neuromyths, for example, that was previously believed. For example, there is this neuromyth about learning styles. Everybody has a learning style, preferred learning style. And actually in the UK, for example, it used to be taught as the mandatory course in 1980s or 1990s, as far as I could remember. Maybe Astrid, you know this better than me.
Yes.
It was taught, and so many teachers used to believe this, that this works, actually. But in these days, it is still one of the most prevalent ones. So we need to keep researching that, but possibly in, let's say, 5 years, 10 years from now on, we might not be, needing to use that evidence.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think neuromyths as an issue of science communication rather than, necessarily believing the wrong thing or such, so maybe as communication advances and our methods advance, then there may be less neuromyths possibly. We'll see. Fingers crossed. So Amy has a really important point here about initial teacher training and education in the UK. So she points out that from 2024, it's going to become a lot more prescribed. She says the only element of neuroscience mentioned in the core, sorry, I can't remember now what that, the CCF is metacognition, learning, memory, and cognition. So all providers are going to have to go through reaccreditation, et cetera, et cetera. There does not seem to be room for autonomy and creativity. And she asks, so do you think this is problematic for anyone trying to implement neuroscience into teacher training?
No, definitely. I mean, no matter what the evidence says, there will still be problems. If evidence says that 100% it works or etc., it is still difficult to implement in practice. Yes, there's still so much going on in, let's say, early career framework, for instance, and they updated it and they included working memory to be included in initial teacher training programs, for example. But we still don't know what happens. So it takes time. So it is implemented. And once it is implemented, we will be able to see if that really is effective or not. Of course, the Department for Education is usually using evidence from researchers, but the long-term change, it is a question. We will see.
Wait and see. Okay. Okay, so James's question, I think this one actually came in first, but it's gotten put down. I'm curious how you determine the neurofacts. I'm not a skeptic, but I know there are some controversies about some of the fundamental neuroscience, like the origins of emotions, that might make it hard to pin down what is a neurofact. I think this is a really good point, actually. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Definitely, it was one of the most difficult parts that for me, because as I said, I had 18 neurofacts, let's say evidence-based statements, and finding evidence to support for those statements was actually hard because there's so much going on and there is criticisms for each statement, etc. But there are some points that is relevant to education and mainly evidence-based. For example, if part of the brain is damaged, other parts of the brain can take up its function, for example. Of course, there are different ways to approach this evidence as well. We're trying to make it as simple as possible to be better digested by practitioners. But also there is this hole, I can say. If we make an evidence-based statement too simple, then we might be making it a neuromyth, actually. So it is difficult to find out. So neuromyths can be used to get this first basis of knowledge, and then it should be then extended to better understand what this knowledge is really about.
Yeah, I think oversimplification is one of those communication problems, isn't it? Yeah. So something to be avoided. There's always nuance, isn't there? James had one more point about kind of the relevance of social findings for neuroscience, but I think maybe we might leave that for now. In fact, maybe if we've got time at the end, Michael would be a good one to sort of talk about connecting different levels of evidence. So I'll just go down a little bit more. So we've got another question from Selma, who asked about the intervention. Are you planning to create an intervention out of your findings? I think that was just before you started explaining your study. How are you getting on with that? Are you sort of advanced in developing that intervention yet? Or you're waiting to do the focus groups, aren't you? So yeah.
I am actually doing doing them both. So I'm currently running I will run focus groups. I'm recruiting. So once I have the focus groups, it will influence the design of the workshop. But in terms of topics, we're still in discussion. So as I said, I'm in Teachers College, Columbia University now. And here in this lab, they're also creating a graduate level of educational neuroscience program that is aimed for teachers, service teachers. So it will be useful to have this discussion between institutions to see how it goes. Because as I said, it is extremely difficult to find out which topics should be included. Even, for example, if we say working memory, it may sound pretty basic, but we can talk about it for 3 months. Working memory. So it's still in discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Yasin. So Erica has a specific question about the intervention and the focus groups as well. So she asks what topics are you planning to discuss with the teachers?
The topics will start from their previous exposure to educational neuroscience. So to what extent they found their CPD level, for example, educational neuroscience training useful, and what they were taught and what could be better, etc. And if they were proposed, if they were presented another type of formal type of training in education neuroscience, how they would be willing to attend. So it will mainly affect its design, for example, the frequency, etc.
Okay, cool, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Sarah. Is there any research looking at the teaching outcomes for teachers with a good knowledge of neuroscience compared to those that do not? So I guess how successful is a teacher who has good knowledge versus those that doesn't?
Yeah, this is also one of the big questions of it. So what is the practice effect of it? Well, there are some, as I mentioned in previous slides, there were like some training programs in education neuroscience that is aiming to specifically increase some type of things. For instance, one of them was BrainU, which aimed to increase teachers' self-efficacy, for example. So once teachers were presented some information about neuroplasticity, for instance, and their self-efficacy were increased, for instance. But in terms of the in-class effects, we don't know the answer yet, actually. So once we have a better tool to understand teachers' knowledge level of education neuroscience, and if we can find an evidence way to increase their knowledge level, then we will be able to see to what extent it's effective in practice. Because if we do not have the evidence base, then we may not be able to see to what extent it can change the classroom.
Right. Yeah, I think you're saying it's still emerging, essentially, like we still don't have the evidence right now. Okay. So down a little bit to Paul. So he is asking about the study from California that delayed the school start time. Essentially, was there a follow-up on that that showed it resulted in better student results?
I haven't updated my documents based on that because it also came recently. So it came in effect in 2022, although it was signed in 2019. It started implementing in 2022. So I don't know if there was any research to see the effectiveness.
So no follow-up yet, but there may well be. Yeah. And did you have a citation for that study on the slide?
Happy to send it.
Cool. Okay. So we've got Matt. Oh, and we also have lots of people thanking you for your talk. So Matt says, regarding the content for your workshops, would the content vary depending on the subject specialism of the teachers and the age range? Or are you thinking about kind of content that applies to all subjects and all ages of students?
Well, it is difficult to say that, one fits for all in any subject. But again, if we find a specific type of, for example, a specific type of topics that is related to special educational needs, that can be helpful. But then we will need to leave out so many other parts as well. So I don't think I have an definite answer yet for this, because it will also be related to how many teachers from which backgrounds are going to be interested in doing this workshop. So currently, as I said, I'm recruiting, and we have achieved so far 17 participants all around the UK. And most of them are primary school teachers, but we will see. So if we have a majority of primary school teachers, then we might be having something related to primary education. So
that's really good uptake, Yasin. I'm pleased to hear that.
Thank you.
Wow, brilliant, brilliant. Anna Laura has a question about where you can do postgraduate online courses in neuroscience, and she's got a few suggestions. Now, I know that UCL does an in-person one, but I don't think online one. Do you know of any, Yasin? Maybe not.
I lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry. It was just about asking about online educational neuroscience courses. And I just said, I know there's an in-person one at UCL, but yeah, I don't know.
There was an online version of education neuroscience program, which was introduced in 2020 or 2019, as far as I could remember, but it was a long time ago. And currently, I don't know if there is like an online version of it. So the master's program, for example, in education neuroscience, that is run by Birkbeck and UCL, of course, they have some core modules that is related to education neuroscience. But in terms of online versions, there should be a lot, but I don't know the evidence of them. So who created these programs and to what extent they are evidence-based? Because as I say, snake oil salesman. So a brain image, and they advertise it as like, if you know this, you will be a better teacher, for example.
Yeah.
It's not that simple. And yeah, there should be so many online courses, but I currently cannot say that this course is actually evidence-based. So because I haven't checked yet. But I'm happy to have a look at it. If you know, whoever asked the question, sorry, I can send me an email.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The reputation of the provider is important, and how good they actually are and how evidence-based they actually are. There's a lot of chat, but we've come to the end of the questions that are in the chat. So well done, Yasin. That was a real diverse array of questions you had there. I will leave the chat open for a few minutes now, because there's actually a few connections you could pick up on in there. A few people have shared details of maybe doing a collaboration. So I think I will shortly end the recording, but keep the chat and everything open for a few more minutes. I don't know if Michael is still here. Did Michael have anything he wanted to weigh in on before we finish? Because this is such an important topic. He's still here.
I don't know if
he's here, but maybe not. Maybe has nothing to say, because you've done such a brilliant job. In that case, seeing as it is 5 o'clock, I think we will finish up. So thank you again, Yasin. You worked really, really hard there. Thank you so much, and I hope the rest of your program in the US goes really, really well.
Thanks a lot,
everyone.
Thanks for your time, Astrid and Regine, Kristen, everyone that attended the talk. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.